Institute of Strategic Studies. Thank you all for joining us in today's panel discussion on a subject that is clearly of immense importance and interest, that is Iran's role in Afghanistan, which is the third in a series of conversations the center is having on Afghanistan under its Conversations on the Afghan Peace Process series. We've already had sessions on Qatar's role, on Turkey's role, and we will be having one at the end of the month on Uzbekistan's role, and this will be followed by Russia and, of course, the United States. And this is all available on our website for those that are interested. Now, the war in Afghanistan, which has spanned for nearly 20 years, as we have all seen, has taken a rather drastic and dramatic turn within the last couple of days, to say the least. Now, on August 15th, the Taliban declared the war in Afghanistan over as the group took over, the capital, Kabul. Now, moreover, despite giving assurances, to the Afghan masses that President Ghani would stand firm, unfortunately, as we have all seen, he did make a very unceremonious exit by fleeing from the country with several members of his cabinet. So much so that his own cabinet members were taken by surprise by his sudden exit, thus leaving the Afghan masses angered, confused, and most importantly, abandoned. Now, while there is no doubt that the US exit, and that too in the absence of a negotiated settlement, really did embolden the group to push towards a military takeover by the group, which certainly was not ruled out. However, the manner and the speed in which the group has taken over the country has certainly taken a lot of people by storm. Now, although the Taliban have assumed control of the country, they have stated that a peaceful transition of power is expected to take place very soon in Doha, where an inclusive political structure will be declared. Now, while there is much talk of this inclusive political setup, very little is known in terms of its composition and structure, if at all. Now, although the Taliban, as I just said, have assumed by and large control of most of Afghanistan, they have stated that there will be no bloodshed. And so far, we have seen, compared to the past, that there hasn't been the kind of bloodshed that one was envisaging, because they have really, not adopted, offensive tactics. As we've seen, the transition process has been relatively smooth, and the group really hasn't faced the kind of resistance one was expecting from Afghan forces. In fact, the Taliban has asked its fighters to follow strict protocols, to avoid the conflict, to protect and safeguard the masses, including those that surrender from the Afghan forces, and not to cause any material damage. Now, certainly, while there have been legitimate concerns of the rights of women, so far we are seeing life, resume, back to daily happenings with, women going back to the hospitals, and as some educational institutions have been, opened. But of course, there is that fair, issue of concern that surrounds the Taliban. I think more importantly is that we haven't seen a very large scale exodus of refugees coming out of the borders, while certainly there has been large scale displacement within the country. Now, at the same time, I think there is a state of concern certainly within the country, and more so, we've seen the kind of panic that is coming from Kabul, with many foreign nationals as well as locals who can afford to fly out, all wanting to flee. However, one feels that the sense of panic is slightly exaggerated, because the Taliban have assured that they will not resort to any sort of violence, in fear primarily that they will lose the support and the recognition the group so badly needs from the international community as well as regional stakeholders to legitimize their rule, even if it is within the context of a fragile, inclusive setup. Now, in the meantime, a high-level delegation of Afghan political representatives, mostly those representing the old Northern Alliance, have been in Islamabad for talks. And at the same time, we have also seen the creation of the Coordinating Council, which comprises of Dr. Abdullah, Hamid Karzai, and Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. Now, while the ongoing transition, as I said, has been relatively smooth, with events unfolding by the hour, it is really too soon to tell what will come of Afghanistan. It still remains to be seen how events will pan out once the composition and mandate of this, political future structure we're so hearing about is declared. But having said that, in all the situation, Afghanistan will be a major issue of concern not only for the international community, but more so for regional countries. Now, perplexed by the instability in Afghanistan, regional countries have come to the forefront to play a more proactive and prominent role in Afghanistan. And one such country is Iran, which certainly has played a substantial role in Afghanistan. Now, Iran is not only an important neighbor of Afghanistan, but it shares close linkages with Afghanistan. Now, after Pakistan, Iran is one such country that has directly been, affected by events in Afghanistan. And therefore, I think Iran does share a consolidated view with its neighbors over Afghanistan, which entails regional ownership, recognition of an inclusive political settlement, certainly recognition of the Taliban as a major stakeholder and component of a future political settlement, as well as curbing transnational terrorist groups, particularly the ISKP. Now, like other regional countries, Iran has expressed its concern over the current situation. Iran's president, Mr. Raisi, has said that the US defeat and withdrawal from Afghanistan is a historical opportunity for Afghans, and I quote, to revive life, security, and lasting peace in Afghanistan. And it is encouraging all the Afghan groups to reach a negotiated settlement to restore stability to the country. Now, hence, in light of the situation, the future of Afghanistan, and certainly the role Iran could play, the center has organized this panel discussion on Iran's role in Afghanistan. Now, we are honored to have with us a very distinguished panel of guests. We have with us Dr. Saeed Khadiri, forgive me for the pronunciation. He's a researcher at the Institute for Policy and International Studies, Iran. We're joined by Dr. Amin Saikal, who is an Afghan himself and an expert and an authority, and he's an adjunct professor of social sciences at the University of Western Australia. We have with us Professor Akbarzadeh, who's the Deputy Director, Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, Deakin University, Australia. We have with us Dr. Sharintinia, again, please forgive me for my really bad pronunciations, who's an Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Shahid Beheshti University, Iran. We have with us Ambassador Asif Khan Durrani, who is a visiting fellow at IPRI, as well as Pakistan's ambassador to, our former ambassador to Iran. And have we got Dr. Hashim Pashtun? Has he joined us?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, great. So we also have with us Mr. Mohammed Hashim Pashtun, who's an advisor for research and policy at the Kabul Institute of Peace in Kabul. So thank you for joining us for this important discussion. Before we begin, I would like to request Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, we're joined, we were waiting for Ambassador Aizaz Ahmed Chaudhry, who's the Director General, Institute of Strategic Studies. So I'd like Ambassador Chaudhry to say a few words before we begin the discussion. Ambassador Chaudhry?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amina. I think this is one of the most topical discussions we are having currently because situation in Afghanistan has unfolded at such a breathtaking pace that it has surprised everyone. At least it has surprised me for sure. But now the challenge begins as to how and what kind of government will we have in Afghanistan, what would be the approach that the neighbors will need to follow, and what is it that we can all do collectively to address some of the issues. I think my sense is that regional countries, especially Pakistan, China, Russia, Central Asians, Iran, have all been calling for an inclusive government. And I think that would probably, my sense is that probably will remain a common call for all of them, that Taliban may have taken over, but they need to carry everybody along. But we would like to hear from our Iranian experts as to what the Iranian government is thinking in this regard. The other issue is the humanitarian assistance, because there are some people who have been displaced And I think they deserve to be, rescued in the sense that they need to get some assistance urgently. Uh, I know that Pakistan government is thinking about it. I would like to know what is it that Iranian government is the view about that. Third issue is the counterterrorism, because the Taliban had given assurances as per the deal they made with the Americans that Afghan soil will not be used by Al Qaeda, Daesh, and others. And I think that's another assurance that all regional countries would be expecting from the Taliban, that no terrorist entity will have its space in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, in the last 7 years during Ashraf Ghani's rule, Pakistan suffered tremendously when Afghanistan government allowed India to continue to support anti-Pakistan terrorist elements, and therefore we think that it will be an important assurance that Pakistan will also be expecting. And finally, the legitimacy and recognition of Afghan government. It all depends on what the Taliban do or do not do. But my sense is that that this will be an important consideration for everyone to watch and see. So let's see. It's a very, very interesting topic. We've had a series of conversations from different perspectives, but Iran, being Iran, a neighbor of Afghanistan, a neighbor of Pakistan, and my personal association with Iran is also very deep. I spent good 5.5 years there, and what a delight it was to live there in Iran and speak their language. So looking forward to this discussion. Amina, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chaudhry. Could I ask all the panelists to mute themselves, and then, when I come to you, then you can unmute. Now, I know that Dr. Amin Saikal is with us for a short period of time, so I will request all the panelists that I will be, asking you certain questions, and, in order to make the discussion more interactive, if everyone could, give quick responses, that would be really appreciated. We will also get views from Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, as I mentioned, who also served in Iran a little later on. So let me begin by asking all the panelists one by one, and I'll start with Professor Akbarzadeh. What is your overall analysis on Iran's role in the future of Afghanistan?
Well, I think I'd really like to echo the opening remarks by your chairman. Iran is taken by surprise. Iran has been trying to play a hedging game, establishing relationship with the government in Kabul, but also providing some level of support and legitimacy to the Taliban when they realized that the US is leaving. But they did not expect that the Taliban would have such a swift victory. They are caught by surprise. I don't think there is a plan at the moment in Tehran in relation to what to do. They have been selling the message that the Taliban have changed. The Supreme Leader has said it, and many of the Iran officials are repeating that message that the Taliban have changed, that Iran can work with the Taliban. But I think that might be wishful thinking, and the Iranian population, Taliban are not viewed very favorably. In fact, the term Taliban is a pejorative term in Iran. So Iran is going to have a very hard time dealing with a Taliban government.
Okay, thank you. So let me now turn to an Afghan speaker, and then I'll come back to an Iranian speaker. Dr. Saikal, what is your views on Iran's potential role in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to second Professor Akbarzadeh's point that Iran has been taken by a surprise, because the expectation in Tehran was that perhaps Taliban takeover of Afghanistan will take some time. And of course, that was also the assumption in Washington. But on the other hand, Iran's policy towards Afghanistan has all along been guided by a confluence of domestic and foreign policy postures. And that means that whereas during the American presence and allied presence in Afghanistan, Iran's main focus was what policies to pursue in order to see the back of the Americans. I think Tehran will be very pleased to see that the United States has withdrawn, but not just withdrawn, in many ways humiliated in this withdrawal. That from Tehran's perspective, it is a very positive development that the United States also is going to be withdrawing from Iraq. The two countries where the US had established a very strong military presence, and now that is really coming to an end. Of course, Iran has always been very conscious of the bases, military bases that the United States has established in Afghanistan. I remember my conversations with Mr. Araghchi in Tehran a number of times. He complained about the American bases, but of course that is now also gone. What Tehran's policy towards Taliban-dominated government is going to be in Afghanistan? Well, at this point, it's very difficult to be definite about it. But my reading of the situation is that Tehran has already established some links with the Taliban. I do recall my conversation with the former Iranian Foreign Minister, Dr. Zarif, when he told me in 2017 that as far as Tehran is concerned, the Taliban will play a very important role in determining the future direction of Afghanistan, and therefore Tehran will have to recognize that, and that's why we have established links with elements of the Taliban. And of course, we know that very recently Tehran hosted a meeting of the Taliban delegation and also one from Afghanistan. So from Iranian's point of view, what is really important is that have a government in Kabul, irrespective of who is dominating that government, as long as it's not hostile to Iran and as long as it does not really cause security concerns for Iran, and at the same time trying to control the flow of the refugees and the flow of drugs to Iran, and is in the meantime trying to be receptive to resolution of a number of issues between the two countries. And of course, one is the distribution of the water of the Helmand River and at the Sistan Basin. And I think that is very important from the Iranian perspective. So my feeling at this point is that the Iranians will be watching the formation of the Taliban government and what composition is going to have and is going to participate, and whether, for example, the 20% Shia population of Afghanistan is going to have a representation in this government, and the traditional hostility that Taliban has displayed towards the Shia segment of the Afghan population is somewhat muted or removed. I think these are the sort of issues which Tehran will be really looking very closely before it gives any recognition to the Taliban government.
Thank you for that. So, Dr. Khadiri, do you share Professor Saikal's views on Iran's potential role in Afghanistan?
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And first of all, let me salam to all the distinguished guests and participants here. As you mentioned, the development inside Afghanistan was a surprise for every partner, especially for the neighboring country here. And today, Pakistan has its very important role in Afghanistan because of its affiliated with the Taliban, and also at the same time, Pakistan is the host of the Northern Alliance leaders over there. And so it's very hard time in the Kabul, and everybody waiting and see for the Taliban measures over there. And the recent development, which led to the entrance of the Taliban to the Kabul, showed us that the Taliban wants to introduce themselves better than the previous times, and now they are adopted in a very peaceful manner with the opposition, and then they let the university and the school to being opened, and it was a positive signal from the Taliban, which is kind of attempts which they want to keep themselves away from their previous approach, but it's not the final. Just and we have to remain and wait and see. The other aspect of the life being and as you said, United States snap withdrawal from Afghanistan surprised everybody and every partner, every actor in Afghanistan. And also it prepared a very rapid defeat for the central government in Afghanistan. And it was a very defeated and failure for the national security of the United States, which even also create an argument inside the state, which the Republican blame the current government, which they escaped from the Afghanistan. And then, but the reality is here that fortunately the Afghan side, both two sides which had fighting each other, they founded the situation very well and with the perception and cleverness, and they tried to save the infrastructure and preventing the damaging of the Afghan system, especially in cities and urban area. And now, fortunately, they saved Afghanistan from the internal tension. And now the Taliban of Afghanistan and strengthened their position inside Afghanistan. And because of being Iranian neighbor in recent day, they are very important for us. As you know, the government and hierarchy in Iran understood it, what's going on inside Afghanistan, but it's very hard in order to justify it for the opinion, and it's very important for that Taliban how to manage the situation again. And as the ambassador Chaudhry said, inclusive government is very important inside Afghanistan, and also Iran is trying to help the reconciliation inside Afghanistan. And violence, war, like occupied, is never a solution for Afghanistan. And the initiative of coordinating council, which including Mr. Karzai, Dr. Abdullah, and Mr. Hikmatyar, and also Mr. Ismail Khan, and the other leader of Afghanistan can provide an atmosphere for dialogue and transmission, peaceful transmission of the power toward the peace in Afghanistan. But all of this depends to the reaction of the Taliban. So thank you so much, and I will continue.
Sure, we will be dwelling more into Iran's relationship with the Taliban, if at all. Now, let me turn the floor to Ambassador Durrani. How does Islamabad view Iran's role in Afghanistan? There has been a lot of convergence lately, particularly regarding a political settlement, or for that matter, inclusive. Ambassador Durrani?
Yeah, thank you very much, Amina. Thank you for inviting me. And really, we have a very impressive panel here. We have, and they are in fact, authority in their own right as far as subjects are concerned. So I'm really pleased to join you. As regards Iran's role, future role, after the change has taken place in Afghanistan, as already stated by Professor Amin Saikal and before him, Dr. Akbarzadeh, I think Iran has already been in touch with the Taliban. And for them, in fact, Taliban, if you look at it prior to 9/11, Iran was part of a nexus between Iran, India, and Russia. So they would oppose and they would join with the erstwhile Northern Alliance. But after the 9/11, things changed. While technically, United States should have been grateful to Iran for being helpful, not only with regard to the Northern Alliance, but it should have been thankful to Iran in the Bonn process as well. But it turned out that United States declared Iran as an axis of evil. So for Iran, in fact, Taliban turned out to be the lesser evil than the United States. And it was quite, Iran considered United States presence in Afghanistan as a threat to its national security. And probably that was the reason that around 2005, Iran and Taliban, they evolved a modus vivendi whereby both sides, they agreed to secure each other's interests. Taliban's commitment was to keep the Iranian border safe, and which by and large they maintained. And that's how the situation, it moved further. But now, as pointed out by the earlier panelists, there would be actual relationship would shape up when the future dispensation in Afghanistan takes over. Naturally, it would be dominated by the Taliban, but this time, even Taliban are talking about an inclusive government, which is a positive sign, because if you look at them prior to 9/11, they were quite exclusive and they were also reclusive. They would not, in fact, meet with people or the foreign diplomats. But if you look at it from the diplomatic point of view, so Taliban have been outgoing, and in the immediate neighborhood, they established their diplomatic relationship with Iran, with Russia, with China, and then immediate neighbors like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, although Turkmenistan has been maintaining a neutral stance throughout. So in a way, there has been a marked difference. Same is the case with their political office in Doha, where they have been meeting with the European Union diplomats and others. So in a way, at the diplomatic level, they are not now alien to the world community. And probably that is going to impact the future course of Iran, Taliban. And I think that in that case, Iran can play a substantive role. And then, as rightly pointed out by the speaker before me, Dr. Radiri, that the issue of Iran's concerns inside Afghanistan, that would also matter a lot. I think Professor Saikal also hinted towards that. And in a way, as Rahbar Ayatollah Khamenei has also hinted that these Taliban are different from the one they had in fact been dealing with prior to 9/11. So these are the positive vibes which are emerging. But we are discussing Afghanistan. Things can change. You never know what can happen. And as Amna, you have rightly pointed out, that the violence, the volume of violence one was anticipating has not been that severe. And I think this gives a glimmer of hope that the future events which are going to unfold in Afghanistan, there will be a level of maturity, especially when inclusiveness becomes the major plank of future negotiations among the parties. So we should keep our fingers crossed, but at the same time, we have to be vigilant. So since I don't want to be other speakers, so thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Dr. Mohsin, what are your views on Iran's role? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My assessment is too difficult to say about the Iran's approach to the new situation in Afghanistan because of the two type of uncertainty. One in Afghanistan, within Afghanistan, the evolving situation within a political system and the military, and another in Iran that the state is in transition or the government is in transition. We don't know the foreign policy attitude of the Raisi administration and his foreign policy team. For this reason, it's too difficult to say on details about Iran's approach to Afghanistan. I do agree that the new situation was a strategic surprise for many countries, including Iran. And it seems to me at the global level, US disengagement from Afghanistan is a positive development from the elite point of view in Tehran. And also, ideologically, it seems to me that failure of US-led democracy promotion and US-led regime change in Afghanistan is another positive development from Tehran point of view. And the humiliation of the United States and damage to the United States prestige also is important for Tehran in its zero-sum game with the United States. At the regional level, it seems to me that it could pave the way for potential regional approach toward the crisis. If you look at the history of Iran foreign policy, they emphasize on regional solution for regional crisis. And it could potentially pave the way for regional solution for this complicated crisis in coordination with Pakistan, Turkey, China, and Russia. But also there is a growing concern within the Iranian academic community, some part of Iranian public opinion on the new great game in Afghanistan, new geopolitical game, and also marginalization of Iran in this new great game. And at bilateral level, it seems to me that there is two different approach toward the Taliban. We have had a very complicated relationship with the Taliban, but it seems to me right now Taliban is not an enemy, not a friend, not foe of Iran. And Iran is hope for the best. And it seems to me that incrementally preparing for the worst. Thank you so much.
Interesting. I will come back to you on whether, the Taliban is a friend or an enemy or a foe. Very interesting. Let me turn to Dr. Pashtun, who's joining us from Kabul. What are your expectations from Iran's evolving role in Afghanistan after the Taliban so-called takeover?
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan. Assalamu alaikum and greetings to all the members. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's worth to mention of what Iran's involvement was before. Also, sorry, I'm asked to kind of load my video, but due to the weak connection, I don't think that will support it. So I would request if the audio can.
No problem.
My apologies for that. I believe that Iran has already been involved culturally, politically, diplomatically in the past as well, and being one of the partners with Afghanistan. My colleagues or panelists before mentioned about that they're also caught by surprise. I think it's a positive thing because now they have a blank paper to draft the future strategy, because it's starting from the zero square one again. So I believe that for Iran's involvement now, they have more now in mutual compared to past governments, and and it's worth to mention the involvement of United States in Afghanistan, one of the major concern for Iran because of their political ties. So now that United States is not involved in Afghanistan anymore, I think Iran should play more vital role in the future upcoming cooperation with Afghanistan. 4 or 5 major areas that I can mention is the cultural ties and similarities that we have. Economic cooperation is one of the other thing. Control and the fight against the drugs, political resettlements, economic issues, including the water disputes, refugee crisis. Iran has already kind of hosted Afghan refugees in the past, as well as Pakistan. And I think due to the current scenario, maybe refugees may enter more to both countries. So Iran can surely play a vital role. As we have also mentioned, the region is concerned that what is the next for Afghanistan, be that establishment of the new government, how impartial and neutral it stays, how inclusive it stays. In all these decisions, we witnessed the Afghan political leaders were hosted in Pakistan the past 2 days. Most of them were the non-Pashtun leaders from Tajik and Hazara community. And same, I think Iran can play the vital role to make sure that those political leaders are heard and they are included in the future government to make sure the government is more inclusive as possible. Second thing is the Hazara Shia minorities. They look around more, expected a lot from Iran to support them, and especially if they are under threat. And compared to what the Taliban government did in 1996 era, so they will expect, if they expect the same attitude from Taliban, which is not experienced yet, but still they have this major concern. I think Iran can also play a vital role to make sure the rights of Shia, more dominant minorities are reserved. These are the major areas that I think Iran can play a vital role. But coming to the region, Iran being at the west side of Afghanistan and Pakistan the east, I think both countries are more should have more assurance, because Iran was concerned that Afghan soil is misused by United States against Iran, while Pakistan was concerned that India is using the Afghan soil against their benefit. So these are the mutual similarities that we have, and both of these concerns being avoided now, or expected that the effect will be minimized. Now Afghans are expecting both countries to be more strategically, positively involved to make sure that the future of Afghanistan in the region is as bright as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've touched on some very broad areas that we hope to bring into the discussion. Now, let me turn back to Dr. Saikal. A lot is being said about how the Taliban have evolved, they have changed. They don't want to go back to their old ways because that clearly isolated them and alienated them, not only from the Afghan public, but the international community. And they keep on saying that they've changed because they know that if they go back to those old ways, they will not get that recognition that they so badly need. Do you feel that the group has changed at all?
I mean, from what I understand, and after listening to the spokespersons of the Taliban and some of the Taliban leaders, including Mullah Brother, I don't think the Taliban ideology has changed, but certainly the Taliban's tactics have changed. I think last time, as was pointed out, Taliban was very reclusive. Taliban did not care whether it received international recognition or not, whether it received the regional recognition or not. But I think this time they know that it is important for their government to acquire international recognition and also to maintain the flow of outside assistance to Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan population is something like 37 million. Most of them still living the people in abject poverty. If the Taliban wants to be successful, or a Taliban-dominated government wants to be successful, then we'll have to really take care of the public. And for that, it cannot really do it on its own. It will need the outside assistance. That's not to say that the only source of assistance is going to be either Iran, or for that matter, the United States, or some of America's European allies. Of course, there are alternatives, and of course, some of the Arab countries. And I'm sure that, for example, Saudi Arabia would be would be willing to provide assistance to the Taliban because of its rivalry with Iran. I mean, as the games are really played in the region, that is one of the issues. In the meantime, Qatar and a number of other Arab states, if not the governments, private citizens will be willing to provide financial assistance one form or another. But we also know the Taliban have had their own sources of income. But at any rate, in terms of its overall international recognition, I think the Taliban have put out a number of statements which could be very appealing to the international community, but those are words on paper and which have been really spoken, but we will see whether they are going to really put those words in practice. If they put them in with those words in practice and they do create a very inclusive government and drop some of the draconian measures that they had adopted in the past when they were in power, then I think they may stand a reasonable chance of gaining the recognition and also the international assistance. But I think if they maintain their ideological position over the tactical postures that they've adopted, then I think it's going to be very difficult for the international community in general, and for some of Afghanistan's neighbors and Iran, including Iran, it would be very difficult for them to deal with the Taliban very smoothly and to maintain a very normal relationships with the Taliban. Thank you.
Okay. Now, Professor Akbarzadeh, let me come to you.
And I'm very sorry, I have to go now.
Yes.
I have to
Are you going
leave.
to be leaving us now?
And I'm thank you very much for having me.
Not at all.
And all the best with everything. Thank you.
Now, Professor Akbarzadeh, despite previous differences that did exist between the Taliban and Iran, there has been a fair amount of engagement, between Tehran and the Taliban. So, A, what does this indicate for the future relationship? And could Iran be viewed as a possible interlocutor for this upcoming, transition of power, or this inclusive setup that, we keep on hearing about?
Well, I guess that's $1 million question. Iran had traditionally looked at the Taliban as a tool to undermine the United States. Our previous speaker talked about how the US called Iran an axis of evil, and how there were threats of regime change in Iran soon after the US went into Afghanistan in 2001. So Iran has been very concerned about the US using Afghan territory as a staging ground to enforce regime change in Iran. Taliban was the American enemy, so that brought Iran and Taliban together practically. So there have been some reports of Iranian support for the Taliban, military action. All reports suggest that the support that Iran provided to the Taliban was not strategic, but merely tactical. That it was basically small arms, just enough to keep the Taliban active and bog down the United States, but not big enough and serious enough to make a significant change in the battleground and give the Taliban an advantage. Now the Taliban have gained advantage thanks due to very much the US decision to withdraw. And this had already given the Iranians a win card to say, look at the US, it was defeated again. So it has given a great propaganda tool to the Iranians. And the Taliban appreciate that gesture and I guess endorsement of their action in defeating the US. That can open up more doors for collaboration and cooperation. But I am also very suspicious and very doubtful about how open the Taliban are in changing their strategy in changing the attitude towards the Shia community and towards Iran as a Shia state on its doorstep. So that does create significant barriers to a direct Iranian role in the future of Afghanistan. But I'd like to add to this the need for some level, a regional architecture, a regional system of neighboring states that have played a role in Afghanistan, often a negative role in Afghanistan, to now come together and provide a structure for peacemaking and state building that does provide support for a government of national reconciliation, inclusive government, and the protection of human rights and civil rights.
Thank you. Interesting. We will come to, there's a lot of talk about this regional monitoring mechanism that could be established, so we will come back to that. Dr. Ghadiri, do you agree with Professor Akbarzadeh that Afghanistan, the Taliban was a tool to undermine the US?
Again, as a tool, being Taliban as a tool depends on a future development. It's very important Taliban to being an origin Afghan movement which has been surrounded to Afghanistan, not to being as an energy and a movement going to more than Afghanistan. It will create a sensitive reaction from the region, especially from the Russia, Iran, maybe the other countries, to crack down such a tendency in order to being a tool not only for the United States but also for the Arab country in Persian Gulf. If, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the others wanted to support financially the Taliban at the capital being as a tool or being as a puppet for the others in area, absolutely the behavior of Iran will be changed. You saw the situation in the Shamat, in the Syria, Iraq, and the others. So Afghanistan is our neighbor, and Iran, it has its own ability and accessibility inside Afghanistan. So we want a natural government which also pay attention to the internal affairs of Afghanistan, and a strong government which being also and responsible for the suffering element which you mentioned, like drugs, refugees, insecurity, and so on and so inside Afghanistan, to being independent body over there in order to talk about that, and no interest for Iran and the other countries to look at the Taliban as a tool. So in not only tools, but also the behavior of the Taliban and their approach to the other tribe and minority inside Afghanistan is very important, especially paying attention to the inclusive government inside Afghanistan will be positive sign which Taliban is going to introduce themselves as an independent and region which now took over the capital and going to be a different movement from the previous time. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to bring in Dr. Pashtun because you did touch upon the Shia-Sunni factor and the concerns that Iran does have from the Taliban. But since you're sitting in Kabul and you've been there and you're witnessing everything, it's too soon to tell, but have the Taliban changed? Do you see any foreseeable change within the group?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I mean, as you mentioned, it's too early, but within past 2-3 days, and even before that, when they took over Kandahar and Herat, which was like almost a week ago or 5 days ago, Afghans have witnessed some major change in their attitude and approach. Actually, today was more a positive day for Afghans itself, because they were also surprised to see that I just heard from some of my female friends that they came out in their general costume that they used to come out, maybe with some chadar or something, but not like in a burqa or something. No one questioned them why they are walking by themselves or why there's no man with them. The traffic police is out there, not in some, what you say, traditional costume, like Taliban's traditional costume, but in their own uniform that they used to wear in the past. Since these past 2 days, some of the government employees were told to kind of submit their weapons or government assets like their car or something. But last night, again, it was announced that no government kind of a representative or government person will be disturbed or bothered. Still keep your assets to yourself. Once we decide, then we will have a general announcement. But for now, no Talib or no one is allowed to kind of enter your home at no situation or no kind of a concern. So there are some major positive changes in the attitude and approach of Taliban, which Afghans are really welcoming. They even took care of, even 2 days ago when they were in the outskirts of Kabul, they announced it officially that we are not planning to enter. We want to enter after the peace deal is done and the official transition is done. But because of the evacuation of some of the police stations by the police forces due to this all Hafizer movements, Afghans called on them and said that please come take over the police stations because of some thugs and robbers are taking over the city to avoid any future mess. Even yesterday, I think more than 100 robbers or those people who are trying to mess up the situation or misuse the situation are being arrested by Taliban themselves. And they have even announced that for us, the major crime is not, for example, you have worked for government or you were a military person. The major crime is if you are misusing the situation and looting the national assets. They even announced the National Archives, National Library, all of them are our national assets and no one have the authority or responsibility to touch them. So yeah, the positive outcomes are coming up. I just want to touch base on my colleague from Iran mentioned that using Taliban as a tool. I just want to highlight or point out that the tool can be also misused by someone else against you. So I think you have to make sure that if you're using something as a tool and leave it, it can be misused by someone else against you. Not to forget that Saudi is one of the major supporters and sponsors of Taliban. They will be one of those governments probably, or is to officially recognize them as the government. So, and due to the past political history and relation between Iran and Saudi, you don't want someone in Afghanistan, as you had a concern about in the past that United States is supporting, which is not having better political ties with Iran. You don't want someone else also to then use this platform against the political interests of Iran. So my suggestion or request from the Iranian government or the decision makers is to consider whoever is in the government, not as a tool, but as your partner. If the region is legitimizing the government, even international community with some conditions are able or have shown interest to legitimize the government, let's consider them as a partner because now they're in the leadership. If the Afghans themselves who had some kind of disagreements with Taliban accepts them, I think the region should also accept. And the more brotherly, positive, and kind of a cooperative approach we have with each other, the more peaceful and prosperous this region will be. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Mohsen, then can Tehran envisage to have a reliable partner in the form of the Taliban in Afghanistan?
It seems to me that it's too soon to say on the future direction of the relationship between the two sides. In my assessment, it would be critical. The decision of mainstream of international community would be critical for Iran to recognize Taliban and to work with the Taliban. Another important factor is the Taliban ideology. If you look at the ideological map of the region, political Islam is at the core of ideological map of the region. And Iran is a Shia branch of political Islam that have a very complicated relation with other branches of political Islam. There is a debate in Iran that the Taliban is part of Muslim Brotherhood, inspired by Muslim Brotherhood and influenced by Muslim Brotherhood, or Taliban is too dependent to Saudi Arabia. If, in my assessment, Taliban is a part of Muslim Brotherhood or influenced by Muslim Brotherhood, the two sides can work together and can shape a workable relationship in the foreseeable future. But if the Taliban, that's the big if the Taliban is part of the Saudi Arabia ideology, it would complicate the relationship between the two sides. Another important point in my assessment is that the difference between the Taliban as a movement and Taliban as a state. Till now, Iran and other countries have had a complicated relationship with the Taliban as a movement. But if the international community or mainstream of international community would recognize Taliban as a state, Taliban would be Iran's neighbor. The two sides have no choice to work together because of a lot of problem in bilateral relationship. But in my assessment, it would depend to the ideological doctrine of the Taliban and also the structure of a state in Afghanistan. If a state would be an inclusive that comprise different factions and different part of the Afghan society, there would be a workable relationship between Iran and the Taliban.
Interesting. Okay. Let me turn to Ambassador Durrani. Now, so far we've seen regional countries, and more so Iran and Pakistan, who have directly suffered from the consequences of instability in Afghanistan. We've seen this in the 80s, and there is this fear of, the refugees coming in, which we haven't seen so far because the transition has been relatively stable. Could there be a common understanding between Islamabad and Tehran in advancing peace and security in Afghanistan?
Hi, Ms. Amna. I'm so sorry. Ambassador Durrani just stepped out for a minute. So if you could divert a question to someone else in the meantime, I apologize for that.
Okay, I will come back.
He'll be back shortly.
Now, let me then come back to Professor Akbarzadeh. Now, again, we are hearing a lot about regional consensus and talk about having this regional monitoring mechanism. And all regional countries clearly appear to be on the same page, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's the Central Asian states, or for that matter, Pakistan, because the direct consequences will be on these particular countries. So I think I mentioned this before, but I would like your views. Would Iran want to play the role of that regional interloper? And if not, because of the historical baggage Iran has in Afghanistan, which other regional country, and I'm talking about immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, could potentially play that role?
Well, I think it is probably a mistake for any single country to become the dominant foreign player in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been the site of a lot of rivalry and competition between states. Has been a scene of proxy war between superpowers. What Afghanistan needs is a consensus approach by all regional powers, regional neighbors. And I think that is something that Afghanistan will benefit from. Also something that all the neighboring states would benefit from. So it would be in everyone's interest to have some form of regional consensus and a regional approach to Afghanistan. Now, having said that, China has exhibited significant promise in relation to Afghanistan. China has a number of concerns in Afghanistan. One is that China is trying to expand its Belt and Road Initiative and accessing Afghan territory and then connecting with Iran would would be a very good way for Iran, for China to really expand its reach. But for that to happen, China needs a stable Afghanistan. So that is a point of shared interest for everyone concerned. China is also very interested in pushing the idea that China is a friend in the region and doesn't have any other ambitions, and it respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Afghanistan. So that is a message that I think the Taliban appreciates, because the Taliban is also fiercely independent and doesn't want to have foreign interference. That is also a message that would benefit China in relation to its own Uyghur population and Xinjiang. That means Afghanistan would practically pledge not to interfere in the affairs of domestic affairs of China. So that is a common mantra and common shared goal that brings all regional powers together, and it could serve the Taliban quite well, because that does mean the Taliban can organize their own government and their own system of state without fearing direct intervention or invasion from neighboring countries or from the United States. But it does require the Taliban to play ball. It does require the Taliban to respect some basic rules of conduct. So that is something to be, I guess, tested.
Now, Dr. Khadiri, again, I think this is an important question that I would like to get more views from the Iranian side and their perspective. Again, the same question to you. Would Iran want to play the role of that regional leader in Afghanistan, or would it like to, again, because of the historical baggage, not only Iran, but Russia, Pakistan would it prefer to give that role to the Chinese, since the Chinese are collaborating with the Iranians, and the Chinese is viewed, they're viewed very positively, whether it's, regarding the Taliban, other political factions. Your views on this?
Okay, as you mentioned, we want to be a part of regional consensus in order to help Afghanistan to stay on its foot and reaching to the reconciliation inside Afghanistan. And misunderstanding, which distinguished guest said about the tools, and it's a reality that the Taliban's going to be an independent body in Kabul. It will be absolutely away from being a tool. In a case, tool cannot rule in a country. Okay, I think it can finish up the ruling of being tool inside Afghanistan. So we as an Afghan neighbor we don't expect it to have a real and logical reaction from the Kabul toward different challenges which we are addressing in the region with that. So Iran wants to its own positive role to help to the Afghanistan, and also Iran is also dubious, and we are monitoring the situation inside Afghanistan. Does it go toward to being inclusive or exclusive government? Does it going to be also Afghanistan as a land for a terrorism, or to be allying with the Al-Qaeda, with the Daesh or not? This is something that will also affect on the Iranian relation toward the Kabul. And it's very important, new body, new government going to be re-emerge and to being also convenient inside the Kabul. So regulation of such a body And it's very important, as the beginning of the conversation told, Taliban on the trace of the introduction of himself is very important. And now, up to now, very positive signs have been seen from the Taliban side. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Durrani, you're back with us.
Yes, sorry, I had to attend some other business as well. Yes, what was the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so since you're back, and I'll put two questions to you quickly. One is that, as I said, Iran and Pakistan are the two major countries that have largely suffered from the consequences of Afghanistan. And of course, there's always that fear that they'll continue to do so in case there's prolonged instability. So in that regard, could you envisage a common understanding between, Islamabad and Tehran in advancing peace and security in Afghanistan? And number two, I've asked the other panelists, and since Pakistan does have, a known relationship with the Taliban, have the Taliban evolved? Because the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The Taliban say they're exhibiting certain changes, but there's a big question mark. So do you think the Taliban can be a reliable partner for regional countries?
Yeah, thank you very much. With regard to Pakistan and Iran, I think the relationship has evolved after the 9/11. And both countries have been discussing Afghanistan in their high-level interaction taking place. I was ambassador there from 2016 and 18, almost 2 years. So whatever high-level discussions we had. And then there's also a foreign office to foreign office dialogue mechanism, which is there, and which is discussing on a regular basis with regard to evolving situation in Afghanistan. And one thing, qualitative change, which needs to be observed is that now Taliban have a quasi acceptance all over in the immediate neighborhood, beginning from Iran to Russia to China, and also the Central Asian states which neighbor Afghanistan. And also Pakistan has a symbiotic relationship with them. Pakistan has a symbiotic relationship with all the Afghans. There are other also non-Taliban factions. Still in Islamabad, we have Mr. Kanuni, Mr. Rahman Rahmani, Mr. Salahuddin Rabbani, Mr. Muhakkik, and Ustad Khalili. They are here in Pakistan. Mr. Hikmatyar was here. They are the, two sides of the same coin. Before 9/11, they were all Mujahideen. And during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they were all Mujahideen. And of them, they branched off to Taliban. So they are basically Afghans. And if you want that, if you are very generous to blame Pakistan that they are in our pockets, then for that matter, all Afghan factions should be in Pakistan's pockets, because in one way or the other, all of the Afghan factions were with Pakistan. Whether during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or for that matter now, others. So then we have to change the history of Afghanistan, history books of Afghanistan, that Afghans are fiercely independent people. So I think Afghans make their own decisions. Yes, they may enter into collaboration with you if it suits to their interests, which is why Hikmatyar, at one point of time, he had his interests with Pakistan. So he was there, but once his interests clashed, he parted ways and he joined Iran. And from Iran, when his interests clashed, he left Iran. Now when his interests coincided with Mr. Ashraf Ghani, he joined Mr. Ashraf Ghani. And now, while he was visiting last year here in Pakistan, he said, I'm not part of the Ashraf Ghani delegation to negotiate with the Taliban. We have opened our own channel with the Taliban. So this is something we are talking about, the Afghan politics, the Afghan tribal system, that's how it works. And that's how it works, not after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or 9/11. It was very much prevalent before that. So we have to, so in that case, I think I will disabuse any allegation with regard to Taliban being Pakistan's proteges or puppets. No one is puppet. And especially when you talk about Afghans, they can't become puppets. They may have interests, perhaps. So I think I can go on and on, but suffices to say that I have to disabuse this perception. This is not. Otherwise, then you will have to change the history of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let me bring him here, Mr. Pashtun, because it is unfortunate, but the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan is important. And, there can be no conversation on Afghanistan without this relationship. We saw President Ghani was consistently involved in this very futile and counterproductive playing game with Pakistan. So while it is too soon to tell, but is there some sort of a change in the narrative in Kabul now, since his rather unceremonious exit regarding Pakistan?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question at the end. What?
Yes, my question to you is that everybody, I think, is aware of the relationship, the strained relationship that has existed between Islamabad and Kabul, particularly during President Ghani's tenure. And in the last couple of years, it's been embedded in this very futile and counterproductive blame game. It is too soon to tell, but what is the vibe in Kabul now, since his unceremonious exit, where he has really abandoned his own people too? Has that slightly changed? What is the views of the people right now regarding Pakistan? It is too soon to tell, but what is the vibe? If you could just add to that.
Well, the general vibe is certainly that Afghans are now realizing that Dr. Ghani's approach towards Pakistan has failed. And that was one of the reasons that the diplomacy or the political relations were not good. Although based on some news that we received publicly was that Pakistan was trying to intervene in the sense of peace talks to make it more successful, even invited Dr. Ghani and the Taliban delegation and play the role of mediator, which Dr. Ghani kind of denied. So they have reached that kind of early decisions that, his approach and policy towards Pakistan has failed. And even in general diplomacy, you cannot be on a negative terms with your neighbor country. I think as I always mention that Vajpayee, the former Prime Minister of India, had mentioned, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. So your neighbors are there and will be there forever. So the better relationship you have, the more productive both sides can be. And I think this is one of the well-learned lessons in the region as well. If it is Afghanistan's relationship with Iran or Afghanistan's relationship with Pakistan or other countries, even Pakistan, India having their own kind of political issues, but I'm sure both countries wants to have a better relationship, because negative relationship on both sides cannot be helpful either. So I think Afghans have reached that early decision that his policy towards Pakistan has failed and didn't help in kind of promoting peace or more transitional, because the Afghans are having this idea now, if Ghani was planning to hand over the power to Taliban in this peaceful way, then why wait past 2-3 months when Taliban took over provinces each one by one up to all 34 provinces? It could have saved more lives, it could have saved more time, it could have saved more damage to the national assets. So the general comment is still the same thing, that Afghans, I think, and especially the leadership that we have now on both sides. One is the Taliban leadership always have had a positive approach towards Pakistan. And on the other side, the general leading committee, which is comprised of 3 members, former President Hamid Karzai, Dr. Abdullah, and Mr. Hikmatyar, all 3 of them have also a positive approach towards Pakistan. So I feel if these things can trend and the future policy or government is built upon that approach, I think Afghanistan will have more positive approach towards Pakistan as well, because that is more productive for both sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me turn to Dr. Mohsin before we open the floor for questions and answers. For those of you who have any questions or comments, either please raise your hand or you can either type in the chat box, because we already have received a number of questions. Now, Dr. Mohsin, Hashim has mentioned India before I did. India and Iran do have a close relationship, and particularly when it comes to Afghanistan, the Chabahar port and whatnot. So, how does Iran view India's relationship and the future prospects? Because they haven't really had a relationship with the Taliban.
You mean Indian approach toward Afghanistan or bilateral
Yes,
ties with
and
Iran?
Iran's views in it, since you do have a relationship with India in that context.
In my assessment, the important point for Iran is multilateralism rather than geopolitical game within Afghanistan. In my understanding, geopolitical game doomed to fail. And tragic history of Afghanistan in last 40 years shows that we need to stop geopolitical game within Afghanistan. In this context, I do believe that Iran preferred multilateralism rather than multipolarity or a sphere of influence within Afghanistan by Pakistan, by Iran, by China, by Russia, and others. And Iran sees India as an important country in the context of multilateralism for the future of Afghanistan, rather than a geopolitical game and a sphere of influence, in my assessment.
Okay. Would any of the other Iranian speakers like to add to this before we get into the questions from the panelists? Professor Akbarzadeh, would you like to add to that?
No, I think
there can
that
be
was
no conversation without including India.
Sure. I think the point that was made about multilateralism very much echoes my suggestion that we actually need to have a regional consensus approach in relation to Afghanistan. So, and I think the Iranians are aware of their own limitations. Iran may have this idea of being a great regional power, but they're also very much aware of the limitations they are facing due to sanctions, due to complete collapse of the economy and Iranian resources. So they don't really have that capacity, and they rather not get involved in that kind of competition with other regional powers who have a greater capacity.
Okay, Dr. Hadiri, would you like to quickly add to that? All right, let me quickly turn the floor to Ambassador Durrani. Would you like to add to that?
I think
Mute. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Am I audible now? Yeah.
Yes.
I think Dr. Mohsinzadeh has raised a very important point. And let me tell you, for India, in fact, and Iran, they have entered into this Chabahar you raised. But I don't think that it is any sort of a competition with Pakistan, because Chabahar is a shallow port, while Gwadar is a natural deep port. And Gwadar can always serve for Iran as a mother port, because right now Iran relies on Jebel Ali in Dubai for being mother port, and the kind of relationship they have had with the UAE. So Iran can also use Gwadar as an alternate mother port for them. And so there is no competition between Gwadar and Chabahar. And India did try to use Chabahar as a route to reach to Afghanistan. But the problem with India is that it will take 18 to 21 days for the perishables to reach to Kabul, with a journey of 3,100 kilometers. And then onwards to Central Asia, you add another 3 to 4 days. But in Central Asia, India cannot compete with China and Russia. And so therefore, I don't think it is any competition with regard to the transit facilities are concerned. When you try to skirt the natural transit routes through the artificial transit routes, then it is not going to work. For instance, if you start from Wagah to Kabul, you can reach in 48 hours. And compare it with 21 to 22 days, starting from Kandla port to Chabahar to Zaranj, Dilaram, Kandahar, and then to Kabul. So this is the longest. So India did try. They wanted to use it as a political tool. They did. For Iran, it was a win-win situation because India would invest in Iran, Chabahar port, and they have only invested on 2 berths. And it is, so far, they have spent only $100 million, while they were supposed to spend $500 million. And so the process has gone slow. But one can understand. But at the same time, Iran-India relationship are very important because India has been a substantive buyer of Iranian oil, although after the American sanctions, these transactions have gone down from $9 billion to, it has gone almost to zero. So this is a loss, and Americans' sanctions have had negative impact. So these are there. But when you come to Afghanistan, India does not have a direct role. So India did use Afghan soil to create trouble in Pakistan, and there are incontrovertible evidence for that which exists. India also used Chabahar and Kulbhushan Yadav, who was running a jeweler shop's front office in Chabahar, and he was instigating trouble in Pakistani Balochistan. He was nabbed in early 2016. So India did try, because in Zahedan, there's no rationale maintaining their consulate because they don't have a single cents consular work in Zahedan, or for that matter in Kandahar, or for that matter in Jalalabad. So India did try to open a second front for Pakistan, especially from the Afghan territory. So this is something which, unfortunately, because of India-Pakistan relationship, are not on even keel, and those are full of tensions. So this is what India has been trying to play. But of course, any optical illusion which India wanted to create about its friendliness in Afghanistan, or for that matter with Iran, I mean, it has busted. And normally, these things do expose themselves. So it has exposed after 2 decades. Yeah, thank you.
Just quickly, let me bring in Dr. Pashtun if you would like to add to India's role in Afghanistan, and then I'll open the floor. Hashim, would you like to?
Yeah, just 2 comments, 2 quick comments. One is, I think, Ms. Khan, you may remember, I've always mentioned that Afghanistan has no right to provide safe haven for India kind of using or misusing the soil of Afghanistan against Pakistan, that's for sure. But I think now the topic of the day is Iran's role in Afghanistan. Let's make it more make it expanded in Iran's role in the region. Iran can also play a better role because India's Pakistan relation have always reflected in Afghanistan. So Iran can play a role as a merger or better relationship between India and Pakistan as well. Because the question for Iran will be, how will you act or react towards Chabahar? Because that's supporting the Iranian and Indian economy. But at the same time, let's not forget that affecting the Pakistani trade with Afghanistan, because Afghans are not then relying on Indian products. How will you play that role? That will be the question for Iran. And of course, the role is not that to close the Chabahar port, but maybe is to play on a bigger role, which is to kind of improve the relationship between India and Pakistan, or at least when it comes to Afghanistan, that here you should have some mutual agreements, which is kind of a win-win situation for all 4 countries. So that's one more thing that Iran can play a vital role in merging both countries, sharing the border with Pakistan, but then also connected with India, and also being neutral. I think Iran can play a vital role in that as well. But it comes to Afghanistan, I completely agree. If it is, someone questioned me that we have so many consulates in Afghanistan or so many diplomats, numbers should not be the concern. The concern is their activities. And if there's any ill activity against any neighbor country, that should be stopped.
Thank you. Now, So now the floor is open. Let me first turn the floor to Mr. Nasser, and then I'll come to General Sabahat. And again, for questions or comments, you've got the box and you can raise your hand. So let me go to Mr. Nasser.
Thank you very much. And also thanks to all the speakers who highlighted a lot of important issues in Iran related areas to Afghanistan. But I'll ask two or three questions. The first is, all of the regional countries or the neighbors of Afghanistan are talking about the importance of coordination. But if the speakers from Iran or also from Pakistan can highlight what is the level of this coordination so far? The announcement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan by Americans have been there for weeks or months, and also now, khalas, the situation have evolved. Did the coordination increase to a level that can make the neighbors' coordination a really important factor in the future? And the second question, one of the most interesting points that was highlighted during this discussion was that Taliban did not change, their tactics changed. So I would ask also about the expected change in the tactics of Iran. We can observe some changes in Pakistan perspective, even Tajikistan, some of the other neighbors. But from Iran perspective, what could be the future tactics to deal with the Afghanistan situation? And third question, or partially it's connected with the second question, it is, what are the tools, what are the cards in the hands of Iran to play inside Afghanistan in terms of, if we can say, allies or groups who are inspired by Iran, or even politicians who have some kind of understanding or common understanding with Iran policy in the region. So if any of the speakers can elaborate about these three areas.
Thank you. The floor is open to whoever would like to respond.
I'll just jump in very quickly and very briefly. They're very good questions, but also very big questions. I think a lot of the problems we are facing right now, if we are considering some kind of a regional consensus, a regional approach to the conflict in Afghanistan, is that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was not orchestrated within a regional approach. The countries of the region were not involved in the negotiation. The US just talked to the Taliban directly and effectively surrendered and negotiated an exit strategy without any consideration of what would happen after the US withdrew. So I think that has already put everyone on the back foot. Now, Iran has tried to, mend fences and establish some kind of improve its relation with Taliban. Russia, China, they've all tried to establish diplomatic relationship with the Taliban. But all of that has been quite a rudimentary stage. We have not seen any significant regional initiative to really take this big responsibility, a big challenge, seriously. In relation to change in the behavior of Iran, I guess we just have to wait and see what the new president is going to do. But Iran has its own set of parameters and restrictions. There is only so much that Iran can change. I suspect we shouldn't be expecting any significant shifts in Iranian thinking. The new president, I think, is going to pursue a pragmatic policy towards Afghanistan, and that could be useful for other neighbors to really encourage and build on. I'm stopping here.
Thank you. Dr. Mohsin, would you like to add to that?
In my assessment, the question on the future of Afghanistan is much more complicated than Iran approach or Iran tactics or changing Iran tactic. That crisis is the most difficult crisis in international politics in the last 20 years. And it seems to me that any country can lead the process of state building or peacemaking within Afghanistan. If you look at the history of the country, you see that the Soviet Union led state building project failed. The United States led state building project doomed. And for the future also, it seems to me that the only solution is multilateralism. And Iran shows in last 20 years that Iran supports the mainstream of international community on Afghanistan during the Bonn conference. After that, and in the foreseeable future, I do believe that Iran's grand strategy would be the support of the mainstream of international community on Afghanistan. And international community is much bigger than the United States.
Okay. Do we have, yes, Dr. Khadiri?
Yes, I want to add more to this discussion that Iranian country, as Mr. Mohsen told, that joined the international mainstream and wants to support the peace and stability inside Afghanistan. Like other countries, we Iran do not have any affiliated group which supported them during the 20 years in order to reach to the Kabul, or being safe haven for some group during the decades in order to find an opportunity and send them to inside Afghanistan. Just we expected that Afghanistan being a very normal country, and with the countries, the standard countries, which can also keep their people and populations and not suffering more from the refugees, not suffer from the drugs. And the other issue inside Afghanistan is internal one. And also a failed state inside Afghanistan will create a different kind of problem for the area. So the Iranian interest is not to grow up in a people or movement or send them to somewhere like this. So this is a current policy which now also expected a normal behavior from the Afghan side, and we do not want any tools to put pressure inside Afghanistan. So we learned how to deal with this issue during these 2 decades, and it's the natural reaction of Iranian side to the Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before I come to General Sabahat, we have Dr. Christian Wagner, who had raised his hand before. So Dr. Wagner, you have the floor, and then I'll go to General Sabahat.
Thank you very much, Madam Director. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion so far. I shortly introduce myself. I'm a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and I mostly work on South Asia, including Pakistan and India. I'm following events in Afghanistan from, let's say, the regional South Asian perspective mostly. I think you can imagine that this has created a huge, the events in Afghanistan have created a huge debate in Europe, and I think it will have far-reaching consequences on foreign policy issues on very different levels. I will not go into this question for the simple reason that I think ISSI will certainly make some other wonderful seminars where we can discuss these topics in more detail. If I understood correctly, I've been out here for a couple of minutes, so I've lost a little bit of the recent discussions that you had. But I understand the common or the question was about the future of Afghanistan or the role of the international community. And I understand that we have even with the new government in Kabul, I think there's also a lot of common interests between the regional countries and the international community, or I focus here, let's say, more on the Western European countries. I understand from the debates that all the neighbors from Central Asia, Pakistan and Iran have a common, and of course the European and the Western countries have a common interest to avoid terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. This is a joint effort that we all have, and I've heard this also from your comments. Second issue, I think, is certainly the refugee issue. Let's hope that we will avoid a situation like we saw in the past, that millions of people try to flee out of Afghanistan, which then will put the burden on the neighboring countries, especially Pakistan and Iran. I think we may also see a lot of efforts here by the Western countries to support those countries in the handling of the refugees. But of course, it would be better to have a more inclusive government in Afghanistan, which would also include different ethnic and minority groups. This is also mentioned by you. I think here we may also see some support from the Western side. And finally, what is also a common issue, what has also been mentioned, is the question of drug trafficking. I think this is also an area where the international community, in cooperation with the neighboring countries, will certainly cooperate. And I think this is in all our common interests. So besides the different questions, who won, who lost, I think we all have a common interest to have a stable Afghanistan, and who will have a nation building which is emanating out from its own people. So I will leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner. Certainly, this is a question that while the region has suffered extensively from the illegal smuggling of arms and drugs, there isn't really a regional mechanism to deal with this issue. And I think this is one major failure of the regional countries, that they haven't been able to come up with a mechanism to protect themselves. General Sabahat?
Thank you, Amina. I take your last statement first. I think that the recent developments in Afghanistan have opened a new corridor, a new window for the regional countries in particular, including China, Russia, some of the Central Asian republics, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, of course, in the middle, and even Turkey, I would include it in this framework. That I think there is a need to look into the prospects of establishing, or at least looking in that direction of having some kind of a regional framework, regional economic and security framework for future. The recent developments in Afghanistan have also, especially in the beginning, the two speakers in the morning made a reference to the rapid pace of development. And pardon me for using this cliche that there is a method to madness. This rapid development also, I think, gives us a food for thought. Why have they got what they have got in such a short period of time? Because there is, I think, a greater public support. And if there is a public support, which I feel there is, I think now that they are in the chair, the Afghan Taliban now shoulder the entire responsibility of steering the country out of the all the quagmire that it has been in for the last 40 years. And so now, therefore, reconstruction, reconciliation will be their main focus, in which all the regional countries, in particular Iran and Pakistan, I would add, because we are the two countries, Pakistan and Iran are the two countries which provide the avenues or the corridors for the transportation and for the economy. So I'm looking at, rather I would recommend that all the regional countries may look at the possibility of establishing an economic regional framework, which should also take care of the security. We've had, this part of the world has had more than enough the last 4 decades. And the whole world knows that this is the most rich region of the world. And Afghanistan, of course, has always been in the mainstream of the trouble. Now, if we have this a stable government in Afghanistan, for which all regional countries owe a responsibility to support them, help them economically, diplomatically. In particular, Iran, which shares a very vast, large border, and there, of course, have been areas where they have been cooperating in the past. There was a mention of the Shia-Sunni factor. I was seeing a clip this morning in which the Taliban, in one of the northern cities, was addressing a gathering of Shia participants, and he was assuring them that we want to assure you that there is going to be no such irritant in future. We respect all the beliefs of all the sects, and which is a very good open moment. I think we are looking at a Taliban breed, which is very different than what they were 20 years back. So the future prospects are bright, but there is a shared responsibility of all the regional countries. There is one point at the end that I want to make, that we should be careful of the spoilers. While USA has physically withdrawn out of Afghanistan, it hasn't gone out of the region. It will stay in the region. And there are the global interests, clash of interests, and regional clash of interests. So my last point is that if we look in this direction of establishing some kind of an economic security and a regional economic and security framework, that will be very good for all the countries of the region in general, and in particular, and the world in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Haddad, would you like to share a few words with us regarding this?
Yes. In fact, well, thank you for this very enlightening conversation. Looking at the matter from Lebanon, I was wondering how might this affect our neighborhood. I think it will. How? I still did not wrap my head around it. But in fact, I have a question regarding, well, how does Pakistan feel about Iran having more influence in Afghanistan, if ever Iran will have good relations with Taliban? So this is the question.
Thank you. A very interesting question coming from Lebanon. So one is for the Iranian speakers, that how will the situation in Afghanistan affect that part of the world, which is more towards Iran? And the second question I will give to Ambassador Durrani. So maybe we could start with Ambassador Durrani, and then I could go to Professor Akbarzadeh.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear
yes,
me? Yeah. Very interesting question from Dr. Perry regarding how Pakistan will feel if Iran has good relations with Afghanistan. I think it would be a win-win situation. Hadn't the global or regional politics not changed, so there was a talk of confederation between Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan when in 1976, when Raza Shah Pahlavi was the king in Iran and Sardar Daud was in Afghanistan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was in Pakistan. But fate changed, and Mr. Bhutto was gone in 77, Sardar Daud in 78, and the king went in 1979. So the germs or the seeds of this closer interaction and relationship are already there. So, and right now, if I can say with satisfaction that Pakistan and Iran have always stood with each other. There are no disputes between Iran and Pakistan. There may be differences in perceptions, but overall they have stood by each other. And then on Afghanistan, after the 9/11, I think both Pakistan and Iran have learned lessons. That is why that you will see that during the past 2 decades, when the American troops were in Afghanistan. You would not find even the differences in perceptions between Iran and Pakistan on Afghanistan. So I think there is an emerging consensus coming up. But let me repeat, we are discussing Afghanistan. So the situation can change on the ground in Afghanistan, which could be detrimental to both interests, Pakistan and Iran's. So we have to be watchful. Yes.
Thank you. I could have a response from Professor Akbarzadeh, and then Dr. Mohsen and Dr. Qaderi, if you'd like to intervene.
Okay, so I will be brief. I know that we are past the time. So very briefly, I think if you take two opposite alternatives, scenarios, one where Iran engages in a game of geostrategic rivalry and uses Afghan territory to promote its own zero-sum view, supporting proxies and really engaging in that kind of patronage building, which would then simply vindicate the fears and concerns in the rest of the Middle East about Iran as an expansionist power and as a spoiler. Alternatively, the other extreme alternative might be that Iran does genuinely engage in a regional consensus approach to push for that multilateral approach to peace building, state building in Afghanistan, and works with regional powers, China, Pakistan, and others, which would then possibly could serve as a model to be replicated in other parts of the Middle East, especially in relation to some of those flashpoints in the region. Iraq, Syria, elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Quickly, Dr. Qaderi. Dr. Mohsen, would you like to respond?
It's too difficult to say the implication for the Middle East, but it seems to me that if you look at the history, you see that jihad started from Afghanistan and spilled over to all of the Middle East, and then be faced with global jihad. If the countries, Iran and other countries, can stabilize this very complicated crisis, and Iran shows that support mainstream of international community. And also Iran, it seems to me that the new administration in Iran is remained committed to the JCPOA and resolving the difference and rejoining the United States to the JCPOA. These two crises are key crises in our region. And if the two sides can resolve these two crises, it would have positive implication for the region.
Dr. Pashtun?
I do have some one or two comments. One is to Dr. Haddad is first of all, friendly comment. I like the Game of Thrones flag in your background. So big fan. Thank you. Second part is just to echo also on Mr. Ambassador Durrani. I had a personal conversation with King Zahir Shah when he was alive. Actually, the first proposal for confederation was in 1961 to Mr. President Ayub Khan, when he was on official visit to Karachi. I'm just mentioning because let's talk about the similarities. Let's talk about the things that unite us. If our leaders in the past had this vision, why can't we have that? Not, if not confederation, just being more supportive and more cooperative with each other. Just two friendly comments. And to Dr. Haddad, I think, let's not forget that ISIS was established in Iraq and Syria, but now they have, or they had their own kind of a safe havens in Afghanistan as well. And the equation can be vice versa. Some new group or something extremist or some other agenda can be established or organized in Afghanistan if the region is not concerned, and it can spread around to the other region as well. So certainly we share same religion, we share the same kind of other Islamic beliefs, and the infiltration is very easy in these countries from one border to another border. Unfortunately or fortunately, these can be effective. And my dad, being graduate of AUB, American University of Beirut, how he told us about how things were in the past 70s or 60s and compared to what it's Lebanon having. Well, we have to learn from other countries' experiences, if it is mistakes or right decisions, and then kind of implicate in our countries as well. One of the things that Afghans don't like and still are kind of disregarding is if the position is allocated to a certain group or kind of a tribe, which is, I believe is happening in Lebanon. The president is for one religion, the prime minister is for another religion, the head of parliament is for their religion or kind of a sect. Afghans are not supportive in one area, in the sense if you really want to have a democratic approach, that should not be implemented. But on the other hand, if you want to have more inclusive government, then you have to reserve seats for different tribes. But unfortunately, these reservations are misused most of the times. So these are the things that we can learn from Lebanon, and the Middle East being involved is to make sure Afghanistan is not becoming a safe haven again for the region, for any terrorist or extremist group. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pashtun. Now, it truly has been a very, very engaging session. And before we conclude, I would, no session is complete without the wise words of our Chairman, Board of Governors, Institute of Strategic Studies, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. And let me mention once again that he has served extensively in the region as well as Iran. So I would love to have his views before we conclude. Ambassador Khalid Mahmood.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. See, the developments in Afghanistan, particularly their speed, has really taken the whole world by surprise. Of course, the most affected by these developments would be the regional countries. And they are watching the developments in Afghanistan to determine how it is going to affect their interest in this country. As I will confine myself to the topic, that is Iran's role in Afghanistan. And here, it's also surprising how Iran views the Taliban incumbent government now in Afghanistan. It is a matter of surprise because if one just goes back a little bit back in history, we know that the relations between Iran and Taliban were really inimical. And how the situation has taken 180-degree, change, and now the Iran views Taliban differently. This is a good development because what have been the concerns of Iran vis-a-vis Taliban of the olden days? That was the protection of Hazara and Tajik communities' interests in Afghanistan, also to guard against the influx of refugees in Iran, also to check criminal activities across the border between Iran and Afghanistan, border security, involving in drugs and all these things, But over the time, their interests started converging. One was, of course, Taliban's and Iran's antipathy towards the United States. And also another factor which brought them together was their concern about the activities of Daesh in Afghanistan, because Taliban were the entity which was working very diligently to curb the activities of Daesh, and this was also the concern of Iran, because in my interaction with the Iranian authorities, I found that they thought that Daesh was a creation of United States and is being propped up by Gulf countries, and so their interests, coalesced, and so when now there is a change in Afghanistan, we see that all the good noise is coming from the Taliban leadership about that they will protect the minorities, that they would go for inclusive government. And this will meet Iranian concerns, because it is not only the words, but I was reading somewhere that even I think Governor of Herat is from Hazara community, and in their military setup also important responsibilities have been given to Hazaras. So it means they are instilling good confidence in Iran, and this also suits the larger interests of both countries in the greater economic collaboration between them. So I would conclude by saying that the nature of Iran's relations the new government would depend upon how much Taliban walk their talk, what they are saying, how far they implement or put in practice their assurances. So far, it looks that they are on the right path, and this is a good development. It instills some hope of a favorable atmosphere in the whole region, including greater understanding between Afghanistan and Iran, which would also be to the great benefit of Pakistan, because whenever Iran and Pakistan have not been on the same page, it has worked to the detriment of both countries. But now things are looking up, and let's hope for the best in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. Well, this brings us to the end of today's session. I think it's really been engaging, and I think I will just conclude by saying that while many in the international community seem to view Afghanistan as a regional issue or problem, let us not forget that it has always had the seeds of a global phenomena, and I think it is important for the regional as well as extra-regional countries to come together and push for an inclusive political setup, because it is a shared responsibility. So with these words, I would just like to once again express my gratitude to all the panelists, beginning with Dr. Ghadari, Professor Akbarzadeh, Dr. Saikal, who unfortunately had to leave, Dr. Mohsen, of course, our own Ambassador Asif Khan Durrani, and of course, Dr. Pashtun from Kabul. So thank you once again, and good afternoon from Islamabad.
Thank you. Thank you so much.